200 head of cattle came through her fence line at 4 in the morning, not by accident, not because a gate blew open in the wind, but because a truck had backed up to that fence in the dark and let every single one of them loose into 80 acres of wheat 3 weeks from harvest. By sunrise, there wasn't a stalk left standing taller than a man's boot. She didn't call the sheriff first. She didn't call a lawyer first either. She stood at the edge of what used to be her entire year's income, and she did the math on exactly how much a man 2 properties over had just spent trying to put her out of business. And she started smiling, because he'd just made the first mistake of his life. If you've ever watched someone try to destroy you and hand you exactly what you needed instead, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. Her name was Eleanor Vance, 51 years old, and the wheat field belonging to her husband's dead and gone family had been the only thing standing between her and selling out entirely for 2 years running. Her husband, Walt, had died 3 winters back, a heart attack in the tractor cab that nobody saw coming, and Eleanor had spent every season since trying to hold together 400 acres that had taken 2 people working full tilt to manage even in good years. She wasn't a stranger to the work. She'd married into it at 26 and put in 25 years learning it from the ground up. But grief and a farm's books don't share the same math. And by the 3rd year alone, the operation was hanging by threads, thin enough that everyone in the county could see it, including the man who owned the sprawling cattle operation directly to her east. His name was Desmond Ruiz, and he'd been trying to buy Eleanor's land for 18 months, first through a polite offer delivered by his lawyer, then through a slightly less polite second offer, after she turned the first one down, then through a pattern of small, deniable pressures that Eleanor had started keeping a private log of without telling anyone why. A water rights dispute that conveniently favored his upstream diversion. A county road maintenance request that somehow never got scheduled on her stretch of gravel. A grazing lease he outbid her on by exactly enough to make it look competitive rather than personal, though everyone who knew the actual land values understood it wasn't close. Eleanor had grown up 2 counties over on a much smaller place, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher, and had come to farming entirely through marrying into it, which some of the old families in the area had never quite let her forget, treating her like competent help rather than an owner even after 2.5 decades. That undercurrent, she suspected, was part of why Desmond thought he could push her out with pressure a long-time family operation might have pushed back against harder. He'd misjudged, though he wouldn't understand how badly for several more weeks. What Desmond hadn't accounted for was the particular kind of stubbornness that comes from having built a life twice. Once as a mechanic's daughter learning to make do with less, and once as a farmer's wife learning a trade most people assumed she'd absorbed by osmosis, rather than years of deliberate, humbling effort. Walt had taught her plenty in their marriage, but the parts of the operation she was proudest of, the soil chemistry, the equipment maintenance, the fine judgment of when a field was truly ready, she'd learned largely on her own in the years since his death. Out of necessity and a refusal to let the place slide the way everyone quietly expected it to, the wheat had been Eleanor's one genuine bright spot that year, a variety she'd switched to on the advice of an old agronomist named Hollis Pruitt after 2 disappointing corn seasons in a row, drought-tolerant and suited to marginal ground that hadn't performed well under her husband's old rotation. It had been thriving beyond anything she'd grown on that particular field before, and she'd already lined up a contract with a regional flour mill, paying a premium for the specific protein content her soil and that seed combination were producing. It was, by a wide margin, going to be the best single harvest of her 3 years running the place alone. Which made it, as it turned out, exactly the target Desmond decided would finally break her. The cattle came through in the deep dark hours after midnight, someone having cut a 200-foot section of her boundary fence and driven a truck up to it, letting the herd pour through into a field that had, 12 hours earlier, been 3 weeks from a harvest that would have kept her solvent through the following 2 years. By the time Eleanor's dog woke her with frantic barking around 4:30 and she got out to the field with a flashlight, the damage was already total. 200 cattle had spent hours grazing, trampling, and bedding down in standing wheat, and there was nothing left worth harvesting across the entire 80 acres. She recognized the brand on the cattle before the sun was fully up. Everyone in the county would have recognized it. Desmond Ruiz ran the largest herd for 30 miles, and there was no plausible story about how 200 head of his cattle had wandered 8 miles cross-country and through a cut fence entirely on their own. What Eleanor did next surprised the handful of people who found out about it in the following days, mostly because it surprised her too. She didn't call the sheriff that morning, though she eventually would, once she'd had time to think through exactly how she wanted to use what had just happened. Instead, she called Hollis Pruitt, the retired agronomist who'd steered her toward that wheat variety in the first place, and she asked him a question that had started forming in her head almost as soon as she understood the scale of the loss. If 200 cattle had just spent a night grazing and bedding down across 80 acres of a specific drought-tolerant wheat variety, what, exactly, had that done to the soil underneath it? Hollis drove out within the hour, and the two of them walked the ruined field together in the gray early light, Eleanor asking questions faster than he could fully answer them. He explained that intensive short-term grazing, while it had obviously destroyed her standing crop, had also done something farmers deliberately paid for in certain soil-building rotations: heavy manure deposit, hoof action breaking up compacted surface soil, trampled plant matter working itself into the ground as organic material. It wasn't a total loss in the way it looked. It was, in a strange and infuriating way, an extremely expensive and completely unauthorized version of a practice called mob grazing that regenerative farmers paid real money to replicate on purpose. That didn't get her wheat back, and Eleanor was clear-eyed about that loss, calling the flour mill herself later that week to explain the contract couldn't be filled, and absorbing a hit to her reputation with them that she knew would take time to repair. But it planted something else in her, a slow-forming idea that Hollis, when she started asking increasingly specific questions about soil nitrogen and organic matter testing, recognized before she'd fully articulated it herself. She filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department 3 days later, once she'd photographed the cut fence, the trampled field, and matched the brand against county livestock registration records that confirmed exactly what everyone already suspected. Desmond's lawyer offered a quiet settlement almost immediately, clearly hoping to make the matter disappear before it became a public dispute that might complicate his other business relationships in the county. The initial offer covered, by generous calculation, perhaps 60% of what the lost wheat contract had actually been worth. Eleanor didn't take it. She'd spent the 3 days since the incident doing something Desmond apparently hadn't anticipated her being capable of, which was quietly consulting an agricultural attorney 2 counties over about exactly how trespass and property damage claims worked, when the damage in question had also, provably, delivered a measurable agricultural benefit to the land. Her attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in exactly this kind of rural property dispute, explained that Eleanor could pursue full compensation for the destroyed crop and contract loss, regardless of any incidental soil benefit, since the trespass itself remained fully unauthorized and criminal. But Priya also flagged something Desmond's lawyer clearly hadn't considered carefully enough. The soil testing Hollis had already begun documenting created an unusually strong, well-evidenced case for punitive damages beyond simple crop replacement, because it demonstrated the intrusion had been extensive and sustained, rather than a brief accidental incursion. Eleanor countered for the full contract value, punitive damages, and fence repair costs, backed by Hollis's documentation and Priya's carefully built case. Desmond, facing the prospect of the dispute becoming public county record, right as he was quietly trying to close 2 other land deals nearby that depended on maintaining a certain reputation with skeptical sellers, settled for nearly the full amount within 2 weeks, rather than risk a trial. That settlement alone would have been the end of most stories like this. It wasn't the end of Eleanor's. In the weeks after the settlement closed, Eleanor found herself driving out to the ruined field most evenings just to stand at its edge, the way she once had with Walt. Except now she was looking at it differently. Less as a loss to grieve and more as a question she hadn't finished asking. She used a portion of the settlement, on Hollis's increasingly insistent advice, to fund proper soil testing across the entire trampled field, work that confirmed what he'd suspected from the first morning. The organic matter content and nitrogen levels in the grazed section had jumped dramatically compared to untouched sections of the same field, exactly the kind of improvement regenerative grazing programs spent years and considerable expense trying to achieve deliberately. Eleanor, sitting with those test results and a mind that hadn't stopped working since the morning she found her wheat destroyed, asked Hollis a second question. Could she replicate that result on purpose, systematically, across the rest of her marginal ground, using leased cattle instead of her own? Essentially building a business renting out planned intensive grazing to help other farmers regenerate depleted soil, the exact way Desmond's stolen cattle had accidentally regenerated hers. Hollis told her plainly that a few operations around the country were doing exactly this kind of contract regenerative grazing, but that nobody in their immediate region had built anything like it yet, and that it would require learning an entirely new skill set around herd movement, portable fencing, and grazing timing that had nothing to do with the crop farming she'd spent 25 years learning. Eleanor's first attempt at running leased cattle through a planned rotation on her own worst ground very nearly proved that gap in knowledge decisively. She moved a small leased herd through paddocks too quickly, not yet understanding how grazing duration affected regrowth recovery, and left several sections overgrazed to the point of exposing bare soil that took most of a season to properly recover. The rancher who'd leased her the cattle, a patient older man named Silvio Marchetti, who'd been doing rotational grazing on his own land for decades, didn't sugarcoat the mistake when she called him in frustration. "You're managing the cattle like you managed corn," he told her. "Cattle need to move on their schedule, not yours. Watch the grass, not the calendar." She rebuilt her approach around Silvio's guidance after that, slowing her rotation, learning to read regrowth height instead of working off a fixed timetable, and by the following season, the difference in her worst ground was becoming visible, even to neighbors who drove past without stopping to look closely. Word moved through the county the way it always did, most of it curious rather than unkind this time, particularly once people understood the origin story behind what she was building. Desmond, for his part, never publicly acknowledged what had actually happened, and the county's unspoken agreement not to discuss the settlement directly meant most people only ever heard the softened version. But two things happened within the following year that told their own story regardless of what anyone said aloud. Desmond's own operation, running conventional continuous grazing on the same depleted eastern range he'd been working for a decade, began showing exactly the kind of forage decline that regenerative operations like Eleanor's growing reputation were specifically designed to reverse. And in a piece of irony that made its way through the county feed store faster than almost anything Eleanor had ever heard discussed there, Desmond's ranch manager quietly reached out about contracting a rotation of Eleanor's leased herd through two of his worst pastures, the offer coming through an intermediary rather than Desmond directly, everyone involved apparently preferring not to have that particular conversation face to face. Eleanor took the contract. She didn't gloat about it, mostly because Hollis, who'd become something between a business partner and a friend by that point, told her plainly that the work spoke for itself better than any satisfaction she might take from the irony ever could. She ran the rotation on Desmond's land exactly the way she ran it on her own, careful and patient, and within 8 months, soil tests on his previously depleted pasture showed improvement that matched what she'd achieved on her own ground. By the following year, Eleanor was running contract regenerative grazing across 6 different properties in the county, including, eventually, a standing arrangement with Desmond's operation that neither of them ever discussed publicly, though everyone in the county understood exactly what it meant. The man who destroyed her wheat trying to force her off her land had become, in the end, one of her most consistent clients, paying her directly for the same result his own cattle had once delivered to her by accident and by malice. Eleanor still keeps the original photographs from that first morning, the trampled field and the cut fence, in a folder she pulls out sometimes when new clients ask how she got started. She tells them the truth, plainly, the way she tells most things now. Someone tried to ruin her on purpose, and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her operation. Because it taught her something about her own ground that she might never have discovered any other way. Hollis, when people ask him about it at the feed store, usually just shakes his head and says the whole thing proved something he'd believed his entire career, but had never quite seen demonstrated so plainly. That most people who try to bury you don't actually understand what they're burying you in. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and stubborn enough to look closely at the wreckage, instead of just mourning it, what's underneath turns out to be exactly what you needed all along. If you've ever had someone try to tear you down and hand you exactly what you needed instead, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about people who turned exactly what was meant to destroy them into something nobody expected.